Welcome back to your next chapter in the history of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. I'm Nicklas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. One thing only was lacking to complete the grandeur of Charles, namely, that he should receive the imperial diadem from the hands of the Pope. He would have preferred to have had the ceremony performed in the Eternal City. The act would have borrowed additional luster from the palace where it was done, but reasons of state compelled him to select Bologna. The Pope, so Fra Paolo Sarpi hints, did not care to put so much honor upon Charles in the presence of a city which had been sacked by his soldiers just 2 years before, and Bologna lay conveniently on the emperor's road to the Diet of Augsburg. Charles had already been crowned as Emperor of Germany at Aix-la-Chapelle. He now, 22nd of February, received the Iron Crown as King of Lombardy, and the Golden one, 24th of February, as Emperor of the Romans. The day on which the Golden Crown was placed on his brow he accounted especially auspicious. It was the anniversary of his birth, and also of the victory of Pavia, the turning point of his greatness. The coronation was a histrionic sermon upon the theological and political doctrines of the age, and as such it merits our attention. Charles received his crown at the foot of the altar. The sovereignty thus gifted was not, however, absolute. It was conditioned and limited in the manner indicated by the ceremonies that accompanied the investiture, each of which had its meaning. In the great Cathedral of San Petronio, the scene of the august ceremony, were erected 2 thrones. That destined for the Pope rose half a foot higher than the one which the Emperor was to occupy. The pontiff was the first to take his seat. Next came the emperor, advancing by a footbridge thrown across the piazza which separated the palace in which he was lodged from the cathedral where he was to be crowned. The erection was not strong enough to sustain the weight of the numerous and magnificent suite that attended him. It broke down immediately behind the emperor, precipitating part of his train on the floor of the piazza, amid the debris of the structure and the crowd of spectators. The incident, so far from discomposing the monarch, was interpreted by him into an auspicious omen. He had been rescued by a power whose favorite he was from possible destruction, to wield those high destinies which were this day to receive a new sanction from the Vicar of God. He surveyed the scene of the catastrophe for a moment, and passed on to present himself before the pontiff. The first part of the ceremony was the investiture of the emperor with the office of deacon. The government of those ages was a theocracy. The theory of this principle was that the kingdoms of the world were ruled by God in the person of his vicar, and no one had a valid right to exercise any part of that divine jurisdiction unless he were part and parcel of that sacred class to whom this rule had been committed. The emperor, therefore, before receiving the scepter from the Pope, had to be incorporated with the ecclesiastical estate. 2 canons approach, and stripping him of the signs of royalty, arrayed him in surplice and amice. Charles had now the honor of being deacon of St. Peter's and of St. John Lateranus. The Pope, leaving his throne, proceeded to the altar and sang Mass, the new deacon waiting upon him, and performing the customary services. Then, kneeling down, the emperor received the sacrament from the Pope's hands. Charles now reseated himself on the throne, and the princes approaching him removed his deacon's dress, and robed him in the jeweled mantle which, woven on the looms of the east, had been brought from Constantinople for the coronation of the emperors of Germany. The emperor now put himself on bended knees before Clement VII. First the pontiff, taking a horn of oil, anointed Charles. Then he gave him a naked sword. Next he put into his hands the golden orb. And last of all he placed on his head the imperial crown, which was studded all round with precious stones. With the sword was the emperor to pursue and smite the enemies of the church. The orb symbolized the world, which he was to govern by the grace of the Holy Father. The diadem betokened the authority by which all this was to be done, and which was given of him who had put the crown upon his head. The oil signified that divine presence which, shed upon him from the head of that anointed body of which Charles had now become a member, would make him invincible in fighting the battles of the faith. Kissing the white cross that adorned the Pope's red slipper, Charles swore to defend with all his powers the rights and liberties of the Church of Rome. When we examine the magnificent symbolization acted out in the Cathedral of Bologna, what do we see? We behold but one ruler, the head of all government and power, the fountain of all virtues and grace, the vicar of the eternal King. Out of the plenitude of his great office he constitutes other monarchs and judges, permitting them to take part with him in his superhuman divine jurisdiction. They are his vicars, just as he is the vicar of the eternal monarch. They govern by him, they rule for him, and they are accountable to him. They are the vassals of his throne, the lictors of his judgment seat. To him appertains the power of passing sentence. To them the humble office of using the sword he has put into their hands in executing it. In this one immense monarch, the Pope namely, all authority, rights, liberties are comprehended. The state disappears as a distinct and independent society. It is absorbed into the church as the church is absorbed in her head, occupying the chair of St. Peter. It was against this hideous tyranny that Protestantism rose up. It restored to society the divine monarchy of conscience. The theocracy of Rome was uprooted, and with it sank the divine right of priests and kings, and all the remains of feudalism. It was now the beginning of March. Spring had opened the passes of the Alps, and Charles and his men-at-arms went on their way to meet the diet he had summoned at Augsburg. Chapter 20. Preparations for the Augsburg Diet. Charles crosses the Tyrol, looks down on Germany. Events in his absence, his reflections, fruitlessness of his labors, opposite realizations. All things meant by Charles for the hurt turn out to the advantage of Protestantism. An unseen leader. The emperor arrives at Innsbruck. Assembling of the princes to the Diet. Journey of the Elector of Saxony. Luther's hymn. Luther left at Coburg. Courage of the Protestant princes. Protestant sermons in Augsburg. Popish preachers. The Torgau Articles. Prepared by Melanchthon. Approved by Luther. The emperor was returning to Germany after an absence of 9 years. As in the first days of May, he slowly climbed the summits of the Tyrolese Alps and looked down from their northern slopes upon the German plains. He had time to reflect on all that had happened since his departure, The years which had passed since he last saw these plains had been full of labor, and yet how little had he reaped from all the toil he had undergone, and the great vexation he had experienced. The course affairs had taken had been just the opposite of that which he had wished and fully expected. By some strange fatality, the fruits of all his campaigns had eluded him. His crowning piece of good fortune had been Pavia. That event had brought his rival, Francis, as a captive to Madrid, and placed himself for a moment at the head of Europe. And yet this brilliant victory had turned out in the end more damaging to the victor than to the vanquished. It had provoked the League of Cognac, in which the kings of Europe, with the pontiff at their head, united to resist a power which they deemed dangerous to their own, and curbed an ambition that they now saw to be boundless. The League of Cognac, in its turn, had recoiled on the head of the man who was its chief deviser. The tempest it had raised, and which those who evoked it intended should burst upon the quarters of Lutheranism, rolled away in the direction of Rome, and discharged its lightning bolts on the city of the Seven Hills, inflicting on the wealth and glory of the popes, on the art and splendor of their capital, a blow which no succeeding age has been able to repair. For the moment all was again quiet. The Pope and the King of France had become the friends of the Emperor. The Turks, who had appeared in greater numbers and penetrated farther into Europe than they had ever before been able to do, had suddenly retreated within their own dominions. And thus all things conspired to remove every obstacle out of Charles's path that might prevent his long-meditated visit to Germany. The emperor was now going to consolidate the peace that had so happily followed the tempest, and put the top stone upon his own power by extinguishing the Wittenberg movement, a task not quite so hard, he thought, as that from which he was now at this moment returning, the destruction of the League of Cognac. And yet, when he thought of the Wittenberg movement, which he was advancing to confront, he must have had some misgivings. His former experience of it must have taught him that, instead of being the easiest to settle of the many matters he had on hand, it was precisely the one of all others the most difficult. He had won victories over Francis, he had won victories over the Pope, but he had won no victory over the monk. The dreaded Solomon had vanished at his approach, but Luther kept his ground and refused to flee. Why was this? Nay, not only had the reformer not fallen before him, but every step the emperor had taken against him had only lifted Luther higher in the sight of men, and strengthened his influence in Christendom. At the Diet of Worms, 1521, he had fulminated his ban against the Hierarch. He did not for a moment doubt that a few weeks or a few months at the most he would have had the satisfaction of seeing that ban executed, and the Rhine bearing the ashes of Luther, as 100 years before it had done those of Huss, to the ocean, there to bury him and his cause in an eternal sepulchre. Far different had been the result. The emperor's band had chased the reformer to the Wartburg, and there, exempt from every other distraction, Luther had prepared an instrumentality 100 times more powerful than all his other writings and labors for the propagation of his movement. The imperial ban, if it consigned Luther to a brief captivity, had liberated the Word of God, imprisoned in a dead language, and now it was traversing the length and breadth of the fatherland, and speaking to prince and peasant, to baron and burgher, in their own mother tongue. This, as Charles knew, to his infinite chagrin, was all that he had reaped as yet from the Edict of Worms. He essayed a second time to extinguish, but in reality to strengthen, the movement. He convoked a diet of the empire at Spires in 1526. to take steps for executing the edict which had been passed with their concurrence 5 years before, at Worms. Now it will be seen whether the bolt does not fall and crush the monk. Again, the result is exactly the opposite of what the emperor had so confidently anticipated. The Diet decreed that, till a general council should meet, everyone should be at liberty to act in religious matters as he pleased. This was, in fact, an edict of toleration, and henceforward the propagation of the Protestant truth throughout the dominions of the princes was to go on under sanction of the Diet. The movement was now surrounded by legal securities. How irritating to the potentate, who thought that he was working skillfully for its overthrow. Twice had Charles miscarried, but he will make a third attempt, and it will prosper, so he assures himself. In 1529 he convokes the Diet anew at Spires. He sent a threatening message from Spain, commanding the princes, by the obedience they owed him as emperor, and under peril of ban, to execute the edict against Luther. It was now that the Lutheran princes unfurled their great protest, and took up that position in the empire and before all Christendom, which they have ever since, through all variety of fortune, maintained. Every time the emperor puts forth his hand, it is not to kill, but to infuse new life into the movement. It is to remove impediments from its path and help it onward. Even the dullest cannot fail to perceive that these most extraordinary events, in which everything meant for the destruction of the Protestant movement turned out for its furtherance, did not originate with Luther. He had neither the sagacity to devise them, nor the power to control them, nor did they take their rise from Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, nor from Philip the Magnanimous, Landgrave of Hesse. Much less did they owe their origin to Charles, for nothing did he less intend to accomplish than what really took place. Let us then indulge in no platitudes about these men. Luther indeed was wise, and not less courageous than wise, but in what did his wisdom consist? It consisted in his profound submission to the will of the one who he saw guiding the movement through intricacies where his own counsels would have utterly wrecked it. And in what lay his courage? In this, in his profound faith in the one whose arm he saw shielding Protestantism in the midst of dangers where, but for this protection, both the reformer and the cause would have speedily perished. In these events Luther beheld the footprints of one whom an ancient Hebrew sage styles wonderful in counsel, excellent in working. The emperor and his suite, a numerous and brilliant one, arrived at Innsbruck in the beginning of May. He halted at this romantic little town that he might make himself more closely acquainted with the state of Germany, and decide upon the line of tactics to be adopted. The atmosphere on this side of the Alps differed sensibly from the fervid air which he had just left on the south of them. All he saw and heard where he now was told him that Lutheranism was strongly entrenched in the fatherland, and that he should need to put forth all the power and craft of which he was master in order to dislodge it. The appearance of the emperor on the heights of the Tyrol revived the fears of the Protestants, as when the vulture is seen in the sky, and there is silence and cowering in the groves. So was it with the inhabitants of the plains, now that the mailed cohorts of Rome were seen on the mountains above them. And there was some cause for alarm. With the emperor came Campeggio as his evil genius, especially commissioned by the Pope to take care of Charles and see that he did not make any compromise with the Lutherans or entangle himself by any rash promise of a general council. The League had nothing but the old cure to recommend for the madness which had infected the Germans, the sword. Gattinara, who had held back the hand of Charles from using that weapon against Protestantism and who had come as far as Innsbruck, here sickened and died. Melanchthon mourned his death as a loss to the cause of moderate councils. "Shall we meet our adversary with arms?" asked the Protestant princes in alarm. "No," replied Luther. "Let no man resist the emperor. If he demands a sacrifice, lead me to the altar." Even Miamborg acknowledges that Luther conducted himself on this occasion in a manner worthy of a good man. He wrote to the princes to divert them from their purpose, telling them that the cause of religion to be defended was not by the force of arms, but by sound arguments, by Christian patience, and by firm faith in the omnipotent God. The reformer strove at the same time to uphold the hearts of all by directing their eyes to heaven. His noble hymn, "A strong tower is our God," began to be heard in all the churches of Germany. Its heroic strains, pealed forth by thousands of voices, and swelling grandly aloft, kindled the soul and augmented the confidence and courage of the Protestant host. It continued to be sung in the public assemblies during all the time the Diet was in session. The emperor, dating from Bologna, January 21st, 1530, had summoned the Diet to meet on April 8th. The day was now at hand, and the Protestant princes began to prepare for their journey to Augsburg. On Sunday, April 3rd, the Elector of Saxony and the nobles and theologians who were to accompany him assembled at the castle church, Torgau, to join in prayer that God would inspire them with a spirit becoming the crisis that had arrived. Luther preached from the text, "Whosoever shall confess me before men, him will I also confess before my Father who is in heaven." The keynote struck before the men, "Him will I also confess before my Father who is in heaven." The keynote struck by the sermon was worthily sustained by the magnanimity of the princes at Augsburg. On the afternoon of the same day, the elector set out, accompanied by John Frederick, his son, Francis, Duke of Luneburg, Wolfgang, Prince of Anhalt, and Albert, Count of Mansfield. The theologians whom the elector took with him to advise with at the Diet were Luther, Melanchthon, and Jonas. To these Spalatin was afterwards added. They made a fine appearance as they rode out of Torgau, escorted by a troop of 160 horsemen, in scarlet cloaks embroidered with gold. But the spectators saw them depart with many anxious thoughts. They were going to confess a faith which the emperor had proscribed. Would they not draw upon themselves the tempest of his wrath? Would they return in like fashion as they had seen them go? The hymn, "A strong tower is our God," would burst forth at intervals from the troop, and rising in swelling strains which drowned the tramp of their horses and the clang of their armor, increased yet more the courage in which their journey was begun, continued, and ended. On the eve of Palm Sunday, they arrived at Weimar. They halted here over Sunday, and Luther again preached. Resuming their journey early in the week, they came at the close of it to the elector's castle of Coburg, on the banks of the Itz. The reformer, delivering an address or preaching a sermon at the end of every day's march. Starting from Coburg on the 23rd of April, the cavalcade proceeded on its way, passing through the towns of Bamberg and Nuremberg. And on the 2nd of May, the elector and his company entered the gates of Augsburg. It had been confidently predicted that Prince John of Saxony would not attend the Diet. He was too obnoxious to the emperor, it was said, to beard the lion in his den. To the amazement of everyone, the elector was the first of all the princes to appear on the scene. Soon the other princes, Popish and Protestant, began to arrive. Their entrance into Augsburg was with no little pomp. They came attended by their retainers, whose numbers and equipment were on a scale that corresponded with the power and wealth of the Lord they followed. Clad in armor, bearing banners blazoned with devices, and proclaiming their approach with the sound of drum and clarion, they took more like men mustering for battle than assembling for the settlement of the creed of Christendom, the object specified in the emperor's summons. But in those days no discussion, even on religious questions, was thought to have much weight unless it was conducted amid the symbols of authority and the blaze of power. On the 12th of May, the Landgrave of Hesse entered Augsburg, accompanied by 120 horsemen, and 3 days thereafter, the deputies of the good town of Nuremberg arrived to take part in the deliberations, bringing with them Osiander, the Protestant pastor of that place. Since the memorable Diet at Worms, 1521, Germany had not been as deeply and universally agitated as it was at this hour. A decisive trial of strength was at hand between the two parties. Great and lasting issues must come out of the Diet. The people followed their deputies to Augsburg with their prayers. They saw the approach of the tempest in that of the emperor and his legions. But the nearer he came, the louder they raised the song in all the churches and assemblies, "A strong tower is our God." The fact that Charles was to be present, as well as the gravity of the crisis, operating in the way of bringing out a full attendance of princes and deputies, over and above the members of the Diet, there came a vast miscellaneous assemblage from all the cities and provinces of Germany. Bishops, scholars, citizens, soldiers, idlers, all flocked there, drawn by a desire to be present on an occasion which had wakened the hopes of some, the fears of others, and the interest of all. Is it safe to trust ourselves in a walled city with the emperor? Asked some of the more timid Protestants. They thought that the emperor was drawing all the Lutherans into his net, and once trapped, that he would offer them all up in one great holocaust to Clement, from whose presence, the anointing oil still fresh upon him, the emperor had just come. Charles, to do him justice, was too humane and too magnanimous to think of such a thing. The venom which in later years vented itself in universal exterminations had not yet been engendered, unless in solitary bosoms such as Campeggio's. The leaders of the Protestants refused to entertain the unworthy suspicion. The aged John, Elector of Saxony, set the example of courage, being the first to arrive on the scene. The last to arrive were the Roman Catholic princes, Duke George of Saxony, Duke William of Bavaria, and the Elector Joachim of Brandenburg. They had this excuse, however, that before repairing to Augsburg, they had gone to pay their respects to the emperor at Innsbruck, and to encourage him to persevere in his resolution of putting down the Wittenberg movement, by soft measures if possible, by strong ones if need were. Meanwhile, till the Diet should be open, occasion was taken of the vast concourse at Augsburg, assembled from the most distant parts, and embracing men of all conditions, to diffuse more widely a knowledge of the Protestant doctrines. Scattered on this multitude, the seeds of truth would be borne wide over all Germany, and floated even to remoter lands. The Elector and the Landgrave opened the cathedrals and churches, and placed in their pulpits the preachers who had accompanied them from Saxony and Hesse. Crowded congregations, day by day, hung upon their lips. They fed eagerly on the bread of the word. The preachers were animated by the thought that they had all Germany, in a sense, for their audience. Although the emperor had sought to inflict a deadly wound on Catholicism, no more effectual way could he have taken than to summon this Diet. The papists were confounded by the courage of the Lutherans. They trembled when they thought what the consequences must be, and they resolved to counteract the efforts of the Lutheran sermons by preaching a purer orthodoxy. To this there could be no possible objection on the part of the Protestants. The suffragan and chaplain of the bishop mounted the pulpit, but only to discover, when there, that they had not learned how to preach. They vociferated at their utmost pitch, but the audience soon got tired of the noise, and remarking with a significant shrug that these predicants were blockheads, retreated, leaving them to listen to the echoes of their own voice in their empty cathedrals. When the elector set out for Augsburg, his cavaliers, in their scarlet cloaks, were not his only attendants. He invited, as we have seen, Luther, Melanchthon, and Jonas to accompany him to the Diet. On these would devolve the chief task of preparing the weapons with which the princes were to do battle, and directing the actual combatants how to deal the blow. On the journey, however, it occurred to the elector that over Luther there still hung the anathema of the Pope and the ban of the empire. It might not, therefore, be safe to carry the reformer to Augsburg while the Edict of Worms was still unrepealed. Even granting that the elector should be able to shield him from harm, might not Charles construe Luther's appearance at the Diet into a personal affront? It was resolved accordingly that Luther should remain at Coburg. Here it was easy to keep informed of all that was passing in the Diet, and to have his advice at any moment. Luther would thus be present, though invisible, at Augsburg. The reformer at once acquiesced in this arrangement. The castle of Coburg, on the banks of the river Itz, overlooking the town, was assigned him for his residence. From this place we find him, on April the 22nd, writing to Melanchthon, "I shall make a Zion of this Sinai. I shall build here 3 tabernacles, one to the Psalms, another to the prophets, and a third to Aesop." He was at the time diversifying his graver labors by translating Aesop's fables. "I reside," he continues, "in a vast abode which overlooks the city. I have the keys of all its apartments. There are scarcely 30 persons within the fortress, of whom 12 are watchers by night, and 2 others sentinels who are constantly posted on the castle heights." The Elector John was statesman, like sagacity as well as Christian zeal. A fine union, of which that age presents many noble examples, saw the necessity of presenting to the Diet a summary of Protestant doctrine. Nothing of the sort as yet existed. The Protestant faith was to be learned, first of all in the Scriptures, next in the numerous, arid, widely diffused writings of Luther and other theologians, and lastly in the general belief and confession of the Christian people. But over and above these, it was desirable to have some systematized, accurate, and authoritative statement of the Protestant doctrines to present to the Diet now about to convene. It was due to the Reformers themselves, to whom it would serve as a bond of union, and whose apology or defense it would be to the world, and it was due to their foes, who it was to be supposed in charity were condemning what, to a large extent, they were ignorant of. It was worthy of notice that the first suggestion of what has since become so famous under the name of the Augsburg Confession came not from the clergy of the Protestant Church, but from the laity. When political actors appear before us on this great stage, we do them only justice to say that they were inspired by Christian motives, and aimed at gaining great spiritual ends. John of Saxony and Philip of Hesse did not covet the spoils of Rome. They sought the vindication of the truth and the reformation of society. The Elector of Saxony issued an order in the middle of March 1530 to the theologians of Wittenberg to draw up a summary of the Protestant faith. It was meant to set forth concisely the main doctrines which the Protestants held, and the points in which they differed from Rome. Luther, Melanchthon, Jonas, and Pomeranus jointly undertook the task. Their labors were embodied in 17 articles, and were delivered to the elector at Torgau, and hence their name, the Torgau Articles. These articles, a few weeks afterwards, were enlarged and remodeled by Melanchthon, with a view to their being read in the Diet as the Confession of the Protestants. The great scholar and divine devoted laborious days and nights to this important work. Amid the distractions and din of Augsburg, nothing did he spare which a penetrating judgment and a lovely genius could not make to this confession, in point of its admirable order, its clearness of statement, and beauty of style, such as would charm the ears and lead captive the understandings and hearts of the Roman Catholics in the Diet. They must listen, he said, in spite of themselves. Everything was put in the least offensive form. Wittenberg and Rome were brought as near to each other as the eternal barrier between the two permitted. The document, when finished, was sent to Luther and approved by him. In returning it, the reformer accompanied it with a letter to the elector, in which he spoke of it in the following terms: I have read over Master Philip's apology. It pleases me right well, and I know not how to better or alter anything in it, and will not hazard the attempt, for I cannot tread so softly and gently. Christ our Lord help that it bear much and great fruit, as we hope and pray. Amen. Will the Diet listen? Will the genius of Melanchthon triumph over the conqueror of Pavia, and induce him to withdraw his ban and sit down at the feet of Luther, or rather of Holy Scripture? These were the questions men were eagerly asking. Chapter 21. The Emperor arrives at Augsburg. Opening of the Diet. Arrivals. The Archbishop of Cologne, etc. Charles. Pleasantries of Luther. Diet of the Crows. An allegory intimation of the Emperor's coming. The princes meet him at the torrent Lech. Splendor of the procession. Seckendorf's description. Enters Augsburg. Accident. Rites in the cathedral. Charles's interview with the Protestant princes. Demands the silencing of their preachers. Protestants refuse. Final arrangement. Opening of Diet. Procession of Corpus Christi. Shall the elector join the procession? Sermon of Papal Nuncio. The Turk and Lutherans compared. Calls on Charles to use the sword against the latter. Scarcely a day passed in these stirring weeks without some stately procession entering at the gates of Augsburg. On the 17th of May came the Archbishop of Cologne, and on the day following, the Archbishop of Mainz. A few days later, George, Margrave of Brandenburg, the ally of the elector, passed through the streets with an escort of 200 horsemen in green liveries and armor. A German wagon filled with his learned men and preachers brought up the rear. At last came the crown and flower of all these grand spectacles, Charles, on whose head were united the crowns of Spain, the iron crown of Lombardy, and the imperial diadem, now twice bestowed, made his entry into Augsburg with great pomp on the 15th of June, 1530. It was long past the day, April 8th, for which the Diet had been summoned, but the Emperor will journey as his many weighty affairs will permit, and the princes must wait. While the Emperor delayed and the Diet was not open, and the courier from Augsburg posted along the highway which ran close to the foot of the castle of Coburg, Without halting to send in letter or message to its occupant, the anxieties of Luther increased from one day to another. The reformer, to beguile his thoughts, issued his edict convoking a diet at Coburg. The summons was instantly obeyed. Quite a crowd of members assembled, and Luther does ample justice to their eloquence. "You are about to go to Augsburg," says he, writing to Spalatin, May 9th, "without having examined the auspices, and not knowing as yet when they will permit you to commence. As for me, I am in the thick of another diet. Here I see magnanimous kings, dukes, and nobles consult over the affairs of their realm, and with unremitting clang proclaim their decrees and dogmas through the air. They do not meet in caves, or dens of courts called palaces, but the spacious heaven is their roof, verdant grass and foliage their pavement, and their walls are wide as the ends of the earth. They are not arrayed in gold and silk, but all wear a vestment black, have eyes of gray hue, and speak in the same music, save the diversity of youth and age. Horses and harness they spurn at, and move on the rapid wheels of wings. As far as I understand the herald of their decrees, they have unanimously resolved to wage this whole year a war on barley oats and every kind of grain, and great deeds will be done. Here we sit, spectators of this diet, and, to our great joy and comfort, observe and hear how the princes, lords, and estates of the empire are all singing so merrily and living so heartily. But it gives us especial pleasure to remark, with that knight-like air, they swing their tails, stroke their bills, tilt at one another, and strike and parry, so that we believe they will win great honor over the wheat and barley." So far the allegory. It is told with much naive pleasantry, but the reformer appends a moral, and some who may have enjoyed the story may not quite relish the interpretation. "It seems to me," says he, "that these rooks and jackdaws are after all nothing else but the sophists and papists, with their preaching and writing, who will fain present themselves in a heap, and make us listen to their lovely voices and beautiful sermons." This correspondence he dates from the region of the birds, or the diet of the jackdaws. This and other similar creations were but a moment's pause in the midst of Herculean labors and of anxious and solemn thoughts. But Luther's humor was irrepressible, and its outburst was never more likely to happen than when he was encompassed by tragic events. These sallies were like light breaking in golden floods through the dark thunder clouds. They revealed, moreover, a consciousness on the part of the reformer of the true grandeur of his position, and that the drama at the center of which he stood was far more momentous than that in which Charles was playing his part. From his elevation he could look down upon the pomp of thrones and the pageantries of the empire, and make merry with them. He had but to touch them with his satire, and straightway their glory was gone, and their hollowness laid bare. It was not so with the spiritual forces he was laboring to set in motion in the world. These forces needed not to array themselves in scarlet and gold embroideries to make themselves grand, or to borrow the help of cannon and armed cohorts to give them potentiality. At last Charles moved from Innsbruck and set out for Augsburg. On the 6th of June he reached Munich and made his entry through streets hung with tapestry and thronged with applauding crowds. On the 15th of June a message reached Augsburg that on that day the emperor would make his entrance into the city. The electors, counts, and knights marshaled early in the afternoon and set out to meet Charles. They halted on the banks of the torrent Lech, which rolls down from the Alps and falls into the Danube. They took up their position on a rising ground. whence they might descry the imperial approach. The aspect of the road told that something extraordinary was going forward. There rolled past the princes all the afternoon, as had been the case from an early hour in the morning, a continuous stream of horses and baggage trains, of wagons and foot passengers, of officers of the emperor's household, and strangers hastening to enjoy the spectacle, the crack of whip, the note of horn, and the merry laugh of an idle sightseer enlivening their march. 3 hours wore away. Still the emperor was not in sight. The sun now hung, nearing the horizon. At length the cloud of dust was seen in the distance. Its dusky volume came nearer and nearer as it approached. The murmur of voices grew louder, and now close at hand, its opening folds disclosed to view the first ranks of the imperial cavalcade. The princes leaped from their saddles and awaited Charles's approach. The emperor, on seeing the princes, courteously dismounted and shook hands with them, and the two companies blended into one on the bank of the stream. Apart on a low eminence, seated on his richly caparisoned mule, was seen the papal legate, Campeggio. He raised his hand to bestow his benediction on the brilliant multitude. All knelt down, save the Protestants, whose erect figures made them marked objects in that great assembly, which awaited, with bowed heads, the papal blessing. The mighty emperor had his first intimation that he should not be able to repeat at Augsburg the proud boast of Caesar, whose successor he affected to be. I came, I saw, I conquered. The procession now set forth at a slow pace. Never, says Seckendorf, had the grandeur and power of the empire been illustrated by so magnificent a spectacle. There defiled past the spectator in long and glittering procession not only the ecclesiastical and civil dignities of Spain and Italy, but representatives of nearly all the nationalities which formed the vast empire of Charles. First came 2 companies of lansquenets. Next came the 6 electors, with the noblemen of their courts, in rich dresses of velvet and silk, and their armed retainers in their red doublets, steel helmets, and dancing plumes. There were bishops in violet and cardinals in purple. The ecclesiastics were seated on mules. The princes and counts bestrode prancing coursers. The Elector John of Saxony marched immediately before the emperor, bearing the naked imperial sword, in honor to which his rank in the electoral college entitled him. Last came the prince, says Seckendorf, on whom all eyes were fixed, 30 years of age, of distinguished port and pleasing features, robed in golden garments that glittered all over with precious stones, wearing a small Spanish hat on the crown of his head, mounted on a beautiful Polish hackney of the most brilliant whiteness, riding beneath a rich canopy of red, white, and green damask borne by 6 senators of Augsburg, and casting around him looks in which gentleness was mingled with gravity. Charles excited the liveliest enthusiasm, and everyone exclaimed that he was the handsomest man in the empire, as well as the mightiest prince in the world. His brother, the King of Austria, accompanied Charles. Ferdinand advanced side by side with the papal legate, their place being immediately behind the emperor. They were succeeded by an array of cardinals, bishops, and the ambassadors of foreign powers, in the insignia of their rank and office. The procession was swollen, moreover, by a miscellaneous throng of much lesser personages, pages, herald, equerries, trumpeters, drummers, and cross-bearers, whose Variegated dresses and flaring colors formed a not unimportant, though vulgar item in the magnificence of the cavalcade. The imperial guards and the Augsburg militia brought up the rear. It was 9 o'clock in the evening when the gates of Augsburg were reached. The thunder of cannon on the ramparts and the peals of the city bells informed the people of Augsburg that the emperor was entering their city. The dusk of a summer evening hid somewhat the glory of the procession, but torches were kindled to light it through the streets and permit the citizens a sight of its grandeur. The accident on the bridge at Bologna was nearly repeated on this occasion, as the cavalcade was advancing to the sound of clarion and kettledrum. 6 cannons, bearing a huge canopy beneath which they were to conduct the emperor to the cathedral, approached Charles. His horse, startled at the sight, suddenly reared and nearly threw him headlong into the street. He was rescued, however, a second time. At length he entered the minster, which 1,000 blazing torches illuminated. After the Te Deum came the chanting of prayers, and Charles put aside the cushion offered to him, kneeled on the bare floor during the service. The assembly, following the emperor's example, threw themselves on their knees, all save 2 persons, the Elector of Saxony and the Landgrave of Hesse, who remained standing. Their behavior did not escape the notice of Duke George and the prelates, but they consoled themselves doubtless by thinking that they would make them bow low enough by and by. When the services in the cathedral were ended, the procession reformed and again swept along through the streets of Augsburg. The trumpets sounded and the bells were tolled. The torches were again lighted to illuminate the night. The rays glittered on the helmets of the guard, flashed on the faces of the motley crowd of sightseers, and catching the fronts of the houses, lighted them up in a gloomy grandeur, and transformed the street through which the procession was advancing into a long, picturesque, and most impressive vista of red lights and black shadows. Through a scene of this sort was Charles conducted to the archiepiscopal palace of the Palatinate, which he entered about 10 o'clock. This assembly, comprising the pride and puissance of the Spanish monarchy, were here to be the witnesses of the triumph of Rome, so they imagined. The Pope and the Emperor had resolved to tolerate the religious schism no longer. Charles, as both Pallavicino and Sarpi testify, came to Augsburg with the firm purpose of putting forth all the power of the empire in the Diet, in order to make the revolted princes re-enter the obedience of the Roman See. The Protestants must bow the head, so have 2 puissances decreed. There is a head that is destined to bow down, but it is one that for 10 centuries has been lifted up in pride, and has not once during all that time been known to bend. Rome. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.